"Miss Reynolds, this court has no time for fairy tales," Judge Harrison said, adjusting his glasses as he sneered at the woman standing before him. "You are here to answer for your incompetence, not to waste this court's time with excuses." The courtroom chuckled, a few lawyers smirking as they watched the unfolding spectacle. Lillian Reynolds stood straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She was dressed in a simple beige dress and worn-out shoes, a stark contrast to the polished attorneys surrounding her. Her brown hair was tied back in a loose bun, and though she looked composed, her eyes burned with quiet intensity. "I am not making excuses, Your Honor," Lillian said calmly. "I am simply stating facts." Judge Harrison sighed loudly. "You dropped out of high school, didn't you? No formal education, and now you stand before this court, trying to argue with trained legal professionals?" He scoffed. "Let me make this simple for you. You are not qualified to speak in this court." A low murmur swept through the room. The opposing attorney, a smug-looking man named Richard Palmer, crossed his arms, clearly amused. Lillian didn't flinch. "I believe the law allows every citizen the right to defend themselves." "Defend?" Judge Harrison leaned back, shaking his head. "Do you even understand what that means? You have no legal training, no credentials, and no standing in this courtroom." His voice dripped with condescension as he turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when people think they can challenge the system without the proper education." Lillian exhaled slowly. He had no idea who she was. The crowd laughed again, but Lillian's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. She glanced at the polished mahogany bench where the judge sat, then at the files stacked in front of the attorneys. Theatrics. That's all this was. She had seen it before. She had lived it before. But she wasn't here to win an argument. She was here to win the case. And before this day was over, the judge himself would regret every word he had just said. The laughter in the courtroom was still fading when Lillian took a slow step forward. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "if education is the only measure of intelligence, then perhaps you'd like to explain why the laws you enforce allow an uneducated woman like me to represent herself." Judge Harrison's smirk faltered. A few attorneys in the gallery raised their eyebrows. Richard Palmer, the opposing attorney, chuckled. "Miss Reynolds, this isn't a debate club. The law is clear." "The law is very clear," Lillian interrupted smoothly. "And I'm quite familiar with it. In fact, I'd wager I've read it more thoroughly than most of the people in this room." There was a shift in the air, the ease with which she spoke, the confidence, the precision of her words. It didn't match the image of an uneducated woman they had assumed she was. Judge Harrison narrowed his eyes. "Miss Reynolds, are you implying that you have some sort of expertise in law?" Lillian smiled, a calm, knowing smile. "Not at all, Your Honor. I'm merely pointing out that a lack of a formal degree does not equate to a lack of knowledge." The judge scoffed again, but this time there was an undertone of curiosity in his expression. Richard Palmer decided to strike. He tapped his pen on the table, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "Enough of the games. Let's get to the matter at hand." He lifted a document and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this woman is being sued for breach of contract. She ran a business without the necessary permits, and now she's facing the consequences." Lillian looked unfazed. "She refuses to settle," Palmer continued, glancing at her with a smirk. "Perhaps because she doesn't fully understand the severity of the legal repercussions. If she did, she'd know she has no chance of winning this case." Judge Harrison nodded in agreement. "Miss Reynolds, do you even understand what you're up against?" Lillian tilted her head. "Oh, I understand perfectly." With that, she pulled a thick folder from her bag and placed it on the defendant's table. Palmer frowned. "What's that supposed to be?" Lillian met his gaze, unwavering. "A little something I put together over the past few weeks. Just some light reading." She flipped the folder open, revealing neatly organized legal documents. Contracts, financial statements, and, most notably, a copy of the very law she was accused of breaking. Judge Harrison leaned forward, suddenly interested. Palmer's smirk wavered. "And where exactly did you get these?" Lillian clasped her hands together. "From my personal archives. You see, I may not have a law degree, but I do have a habit of reading extensively, including corporate law." Judge Harrison studied her carefully. "Are you saying you prepared your own defense?" "I am," Lillian confirmed. "And if you'll allow me to proceed, I'd be happy to walk you through why this case shouldn't even be happening." Silence filled the room. For the first time that morning, the judge didn't have a condescending remark. Lillian Reynolds wasn't the helpless, clueless woman they thought she was, and in just a few moments, they would all realize exactly who they were dealing with. The courtroom was eerily quiet as Lillian began to speak again, her voice calm yet assertive. "First," she said, "I want to address the accusation of breach of contract." She flipped through the documents in front of her and pulled out a legal contract. She placed it on the table, facing the judge. "This contract," she continued, "was signed by the plaintiff, Mr. Palmer's client, who not only violated the terms, but also breached an agreement by failing to fulfill his own obligations under the same contract." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. The judge's eyes narrowed as he scanned the contract, clearly processing the details she was pointing out. Richard Palmer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "That's preposterous. The plaintiff has all the evidence to prove Miss Reynolds is in breach." Lillian didn't flinch. "The evidence you're referring to is based on a series of misinterpretations. You see, while I may not be a lawyer, I know how to read between the lines." The judge raised an eyebrow, now fully intrigued. "Miss Reynolds, if you claim that the plaintiff is at fault, what evidence do you have?" Lillian smiled. "Right here." She slid a stack of papers toward the judge. Emails, messages, and signed affidavits from independent witnesses who confirm that Mr. Palmer's client not only failed to meet his commitments, but actively concealed important financial information that would have affected my business decisions. A gasp echoed from the gallery. Palmer's confident demeanor quickly began to crumble. The judge flipped through the documents slowly, his expression changing from skepticism to realization. This isn't what I expected." Lillian looked directly at him, her voice unwavering. "It's not what anyone expected, because everyone here assumed I was just an uneducated woman with no business acumen. But I have spent years in this industry, I've learned the hard way, but I've learned nonetheless." The weight of her words settled in the room. The judge glanced at Palmer, whose face had turned a shade paler. Lillian continued, "I built my business from the ground up. And when I signed that contract, I did it with full understanding of what it meant. Unfortunately, I didn't anticipate the deceit that would follow." The tension in the room was palpable as the judge continued to read through the evidence Lillian had presented. Each document seemed to further weaken Palmer's position. Finally, Judge Harrison looked up, his face serious. "Mr. Palmer, this is highly irregular. Your client appears to have significant responsibility in this case, not Miss Reynolds." Palmer sputtered, unable to form a coherent response. Lillian turned back to the judge. "I didn't want to come here. I didn't want to stand before you, Your Honor, and prove myself, but I also couldn't allow someone to take advantage of me, or others, because they thought I was too uneducated to know better." The judge blinked, clearly taken aback by the gravity of her words. Then Lillian added with a quiet but fierce conviction, "I am more than what you see on the surface. I am a woman who knows her worth, who understands the law, and who will fight to the end for what is right." The room was silent. Not a single person dared to speak. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him, as if deep in thought. The courtroom was still, the air thick with tension. Even Richard Palmer, who had been so confident just moments before, remained silent, his usual arrogance replaced with an uncomfortable unease. Lillian, however, remained calm, her posture poised, her gaze unflinching. She knew the judge was processing what she had just revealed, what had unfolded before his very eyes. He wasn't just dealing with a woman who had been underestimated, he was now dealing with someone who had turned the tables completely. The judge looked at Lillian again, this time with a different expression, one of respect. "Miss Reynolds, I must admit you've caught me off guard. I had no idea you were this knowledgeable in legal matters." Lillian nodded, a slight smile playing at the corner of her lips. "I've spent years studying, Your Honor. The law, business contracts, financials, everything I could get my hands on. I knew one day I would need to use this knowledge to defend myself." Judge Harrison looked over at Palmer, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing down at his papers, knowing he had no way of countering the damning evidence. "Mr. Palmer," the judge said, his voice authoritative, "this case is no longer in your favor. You and your client have a lot to explain." The room held its breath. The once dominant attorney, who had been so confident in his victory, now looked defeated. He could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom on him, and for the first time, he wasn't sure how to respond. Lillian turned back to the judge. "There's one more thing, Your Honor." The judge raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Lillian reached into her bag once more and pulled out a new set of documents. She slid them across the table toward the judge. The judge's eyes flickered as he read the first page, then turned to the next, his brow furrowing with confusion. Lillian spoke quietly. "These are the contracts, Your Honor. But what you don't know is that I'm not just a business owner, I'm also an investor. I hold significant shares in a number of companies, including the one Mr. Palmer's client runs." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Judge Harrison looked at Lillian, his expression unreadable as he processed the weight of her words. I didn't know," the judge murmured, clearly surprised. "You're an investor in these companies? Why didn't you say anything earlier?" Lillian's eyes narrowed slightly, but she remained composed. "Because I wanted to ensure that my case stood on its own merit. I wanted to show that even without my wealth or status, I am capable of fighting for what's right. I wanted to win this on my own, without any of my investments coming into play." The judge was silent for a long moment. Finally, he spoke, his tone reverberating with a newfound respect. "Miss Reynolds, I stand corrected. You are not just a woman who dropped out of high school. You are a force to be reckoned with." Lillian gave him a small, humble nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Journalists in the galleries scrambled to take notes, some already whispering about the breaking news. The once dismissed woman now stood as one of the most influential figures in the case. Richard Palmer clenched his jaw, clearly shaken. His hands trembled as he fumbled with his papers, searching for something, anything, that could salvage his case. But there was nothing. Lillian had outmaneuvered him in every possible way. The judge cleared his throat and turned to Palmer. "Mr. Palmer, given the overwhelming evidence presented today, I find it highly questionable that this case was brought forward in the first place. Do you have any final remarks before I make my ruling?" Palmer hesitated, then let out a slow breath. His bravado had completely crumbled. "No, Your Honor." Judge Harrison turned to Lillian. "Miss Reynolds, you have successfully demonstrated that you were not in breach of contract, but rather the victim of deception. Furthermore, your financial stake in this company raises concerns about the plaintiff's intent. This case should never have been brought before this court. He picked up his gavel. The court rules in favor of Miss Lillian Reynolds. Case dismissed. Bang! The gavel struck the wooden block, sealing the verdict. For a moment, there was silence. Then, applause. It started with just a few people, but quickly grew, filling the courtroom. Even some of the onlookers who had once doubted Lillian now looked at her with admiration. Palmer pushed back from his chair, his face burning with humiliation. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the courtroom, barely able to handle the disgrace. Lillian exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. She had done it. She had not only defended herself, but had exposed the corruption that had nearly cost her everything. As she gathered her papers, a reporter rushed forward. "Miss Reynolds, how does it feel to have won against one of the most ruthless lawyers in the city?" Lillian smiled, calm and confident. "It feels like justice." The cameras flashed, capturing the moment. Judge Harrison, still seated, watched her with something close to admiration. "Miss Reynolds," he said, "I hope to never underestimate someone like you again." Lillian gave him a knowing nod. "I hope no one does." She turned, walking out of the courtroom, victorious.